There are things about worthless land that nobody warns you about. They warn you about the property taxes. They warn you about the liability, the drainage problems, the mud that swallows a truck axle whole if you pull off the main track. They tell you it smells like standing water and things rotting slowly back into the earth, and that the mosquitoes in August are the kind that find you through walls. What nobody ever tells you is that sometimes the most carefully kept secret in a family's entire history is buried exactly where no one would ever think to look. In the place everyone agreed out loud in front of each other was worth nothing. I found that out the hard way, or maybe the right way. I'm still not entirely sure there's a difference. My name is Eleanor Cole. Most people call me Ellie. I was 23 years old when I walked into a law office in Clarksville, Tennessee, with a duffel bag $41 in my checking account and a legal deed to 95 acres of bottomland that my family had been openly laughing about for going on 20 years. They laughed because they believed it. My grandfather knew something they didn't, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades making absolutely certain that when the time came, I would be the only one in that family who knew where to look. There are things about worthless land that nobody warns you about. They warn you about the property taxes. They warn you about the liability, the drainage problems, the mud that swallows a truck axle whole if you pull off the main track. They tell you it smells like standing water and things rotting slowly back into the earth, and that the mosquitoes in August are the kind that find you through walls. What nobody ever tells you is that sometimes the most carefully kept secret in a family's entire history is buried exactly where no one would ever think to look. In the place everyone agreed out loud in front of each other was worth nothing. I found that out the hard way, or maybe the right way. I'm still not entirely sure there's a difference. My name is Eleanor Cole. Most people call me Ellie. I was 23 years old when I walked into a law office in Clarksville, Tennessee, with a duffel bag $41 in my checking account and a legal deed to 95 acres of bottomland that my family had been openly laughing about for going on 20 years. They laughed because they believed it. My grandfather knew something they didn't, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades making absolutely certain that when the time came, I would be the only one in that family who knew where to look. Before I tell you about the land, I need to tell you about my grandfather, because the 2 things are inseparable in a way I didn't fully understand until I was standing in the middle of all of it with documents in my hands that changed the shape of everything I thought I knew. George Aldous Cole was not a man who explained himself. He was not a man who raised his voice or made speeches or sat you down at the kitchen table and told you what he believed and why. He was a man of early mornings and long silences and hands that were permanently darkened with the red clay of Montgomery County soil. He communicated the way men who work the land often do, through small, deliberate actions that only reveal their full meaning years after the fact, if you were paying close enough attention. I was his only grandchild, and as it happened, I was the only one who paid attention. Not because I was particularly wise, or particularly patient, or particularly anything. Mostly because I was the only one who had nothing else to look at. My parents died on a January night in 2008 on Interstate 24 west of Montiego. A patch of black ice on a curve that the Tennessee Department of Transportation had flagged twice in the previous 5 years and never adequately addressed. I was 7 years old. I remember very little about the accident itself, and very little about my parents directly. Mostly impressions. The smell of my mother's hand lotion. The sound of my father's boots on a hardwood floor. A blue jacket hanging by the front door that I never saw anyone wear. After the accident, there was a brief and deeply uncomfortable period during which the extended Cole family debated what to do with me. My grandfather wanted me. He said so immediately and without qualification. He drove to the county offices himself the week after the funeral, and he made his case in the measured, unhurried way he made all his cases, which was the way of a man who has learned that patience is a more effective instrument than volume. My Uncle Garland said no. Garland Cole was my father's older brother by 11 years. He was 50 years old in 2008, already running a successful farm equipment dealership outside Nashville, already living the life of a man who had made his peace with leaving Montgomery County behind and never particularly looked back. He was not a cruel man. That is important to say, and I mean it sincerely. He was not cruel. He was something that is sometimes harder to reckon with than cruelty. He was practical in a way that left no room for anything that didn't fit neatly into a ledger column. And I, at 7 years old, with no parents and no particular usefulness to anyone, did not fit. My grandfather lost that argument. He lost it, I think, because he chose to, or at least because he understood that winning it would cost something he wasn't prepared to spend yet. He had other calculations running. He had always had other calculations running. The rest of the family didn't know that. Nobody knew that except eventually me. I went to the Hargrove County Group home in the spring of 2008, 7 years old, with a cardboard box of belongings and the particular silence of a child who has learned very quickly that asking questions only makes things worse. And then, on the first Saturday of the following month, my grandfather came. He drove his old green pickup 45 minutes each way down through the hill country of Middle Tennessee, and he sat across from me in the visiting room, and he talked to me. Not about the accident, not about what I was feeling, which is what most adults wanted to talk about in those years, in that hovering, anxious way adults have when they don't know what else to offer. He talked to me about the land, specifically, precisely. The way the clay soil in the east field held water differently than the sandy loam near the creek road. The way you could read a coming drought in the color of the cedar trees 6 weeks before the ground showed it. The way the bottomland at the southern end of the Cole property That low, wet stretch everyone in the family called the mud because they had never called it anything else, drained in ways that didn't quite match the surrounding topography. The way water moved through that particular piece of ground, as though it had somewhere specific to be. He brought things with him sometimes. A folded topographic map of the property with pencil marks I couldn't yet read. A handful of soil in a paper bag labeled carefully in his handwriting with the location and the date. Once, a photocopy of something dense with legal language that I stared at for several minutes before concluding I had no idea what I was looking at. I was 8 years old. I filed it away the way children file things that confuse them. Somewhere in the back of the mind, in a pile with everything else that adults understand and children don't, waiting for a time that makes more sense. He came every single month, 11 years, first Saturday without exception. Rain, snow, the particular grinding heat of a Tennessee August. 45 minutes each way in a truck that should have been retired somewhere around 2012, but that he kept running through sheer stubbornness and an unwillingness to spend money on something new when the old things still worked. And every month he talked to me about the land, not abstractly, not sentimentally. He talked about it the way an engineer talks about a system he is responsible for maintaining and improving with a precision that only made sense to me in pieces over years. He told me when I was 9 how to read a USGS topographic map. He told me when I was 11 how to find and read a property survey at a county courthouse, and what the different types of instruments meant, and why the distinction between surface rights and mineral rights was one of the most important and most overlooked concepts in American property law.
He told me when I was 13 about something called a designated beneficiary arrangement and how it was legally distinct from a bequest in a will, and why that distinction mattered in ways that most people never discovered until it was too late.
I listened to all of it. I can't tell you I fully understood it. I can tell you that I wrote things down in a series of spiral-bound notebooks that I kept in the bottom of my assigned dresser drawer, in the group home, labeled on the outside with nothing that would make anyone curious. I wrote down the things he told me. I wrote down the combinations he gave me, including one he said was for the gate to the Old North storage shed, a shed which I had never seen, and which I would eventually understand did not exist. I wrote down the terminology. I wrote down the names of attorneys he mentioned, and the numbers
of legal instruments he referenced without fully understanding why any of it was going to matter.
I wrote it down because he asked me to, because he was the one person in my life who showed up, and because somewhere beneath the patience and the precision and the carefully structured conversations about soil composition and mineral law, I could feel that he was preparing me for something. I didn't know what. I only knew it was real and that he believed in it completely, and that he needed me to be ready. When I turned 18 in 2019, I aged out of the Hargrove County group home and moved into a rented room in Cookeville with a part-time job at a hardware store and a very thin understanding of what my life was supposed to look like. My grandfather's visits to the group home stopped because there was no longer a group home to visit. But he called every Sunday, without exception. And in those Sunday calls, his voice slower now, the arthritis in his hands making the farming increasingly difficult, the conversation shifted. He stopped teaching and started explaining. There is a difference. Teaching is building towards something general. Explaining is telling someone specific things they are going to need. He explained how the Meridian Basin Resources lease worked and why the royalty rate he had negotiated was structured the way it was. He explained the function of instrument number 2005-04417-MR and where it was physically filed and what it meant that it had been filed at the Montgomery County Clerk's office, rather than included in any estate document. He explained why those two things, the filing location and the instrument type, meant that no will, no matter how it was written, could affect or alter or diminish what that instrument said. He explained once very quietly toward the end of a call in the winter of 2023 that he had been offered $4.1 million for the mineral rights to the bottomland by Meridian Basin Resources and that he had turned it down. I didn't say anything for a moment. "That's a lot of money," I said. "It's not my money to take," he said. And then he moved on to something else the way he always moved on, with a calm that told you the subject was complete. He died on a Wednesday morning in early March of 2025. I found out by a phone call from Everett Pruitt, an attorney in Clarksville, whose name I recognized from 11 years of careful notes. He told me that my grandfather had passed the night before quietly at home. He told me there would be a reading of the estate and asked if I could be present. I took a bus. I couldn't afford the gas for a borrowed car, and I didn't own one of my own. I sat in the back of a Greyhound for 2.5 hours with my duffel bag in the overhead rack and my spiral notebooks in the front pocket of my jacket, the ones I had kept since I was 9 years old. And I looked out the window at the brown fields of Middle Tennessee and thought about my grandfather. Everett Pruitt's office was above a dry cleaning shop on a side street in downtown Clarksville. The elevator was out, so I walked up a narrow staircase that smelled of old carpet and the particular institutional cleaner that seems to be required by law in any building over 50 years old. The waiting area had 3 chairs and a window that looked out over a parking lot. I was the last to arrive. My Uncle Garland was already there. He was seated closest to the attorney's desk in the inner office in the chair that faces the door, the one that implies authority, the one you choose when you want everyone in the room to understand that you have already decided how things are going to go. He was 67 years old, broad through the shoulders and jaw, with the particular settled confidence of a man who had been the largest presence in every room he entered for 30 years and had stopped noticing it a long time ago. He had built something real with his life. I want to say that clearly because the rest of what I have to tell you is complicated, and it would be unfair to flatten him into something simple. He had taken a small equipment dealership and grown it into a regional operation with 4 locations and 40-some employees, and a reputation for reliability that the farm community in Middle Tennessee genuinely respected. He had done that through discipline and intelligence and a willingness to work hours that would have broken most people. He had every right to be proud of it. What he had not done was stay. He had left Montgomery County when he was 22 and had never really returned. He visited the family property twice a year, maybe usually at Christmas and once in the summer, with the air of a man checking on an investment rather than a man coming home. He and my grandfather had loved each other in the particular way that fathers and sons love each other, when they have fundamentally different ideas about what matters, which is to say, genuinely, and with a distance neither of them had ever quite found the words to close. Seated beside Garland was his son Weston. Weston was 31 years old. He had a business degree from Vanderbilt and worked in commercial real estate development in Memphis. He was dressed the way men dress when they have thought carefully about appearing, not to have thought about it, the right shoes, the particular shade of blue in the collar, the watch that is expensive but not ostentatious. He was looking at his phone when I walked in and did not look up. Garland glanced at me when I came through the door. A brief registering look, the kind you give to something that is less important than what you were already thinking about. And then he looked back at Everett Pruitt. He didn't speak. Neither did Weston. I sat in the remaining chair, which was positioned slightly behind and to the side of the other two. I noticed this. I chose to say nothing about it. Everett Pruitt was a small, careful man in his late 60s with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the unhurried manner of someone who has learned over decades of practice that patience in a room full of people waiting for money is both the most professional and the most useful tool available. He put on his glasses and opened a thick folder and began. The estate of George Aldous Cole, he told us, comprised the farmhouse and outbuildings valued at approximately $260,000. 400 acres of agricultural land in Montgomery County, currently under a sharecrop lease with a neighboring operation valued at current market rate for row crop production ground in Middle Tennessee, farm equipment, operating accounts, a life insurance policy of modest value, several personal items of sentimental value, and listed last almost as an afterthought in the language of the document 95 acres of low-lying undeveloped land at the southern boundary of the Cole property, commonly referred to locally as the bottomland or the mud, assessed by the county at approximately $19,000. Garland leaned forward very slightly. He had been to that bottomland exactly twice in his adult life, both times to look at it and confirm his existing opinion that it was not worth the property taxes. The distribution, Pruitt continued, was as follows. The 400 acres of agricultural land, the farmhouse and outbuildings, the farm equipment, and the operating accounts were bequeathed to Garland Raymond Cole in their entirety. Garland nodded. It was a small nod, private, the nod of a man confirming to himself that the world has arranged itself as expected. The 95-acre bottomland parcel, Pruitt said, was bequeathed in its entirety to Eleanor Grace Cole. There was a silence. Then Garland turned and looked at me. He smiled. It was not an unkind smile precisely. It was the smile of a man who has received something he wanted and finds it additionally satisfying that someone else received something that confirms a story he has been telling himself for a long time. "Well," he said, "George always did have a sense of humor about that piece of ground." I didn't say anything. I looked at Everett Pruitt, who was already moving efficiently through the paperwork. He did not look up when Garland spoke. He did not change his expression. He simply continued with the careful neutrality of a man who has already decided how much of what he knows he is going to say in this particular room. He handed me a sealed envelope and a metal document box with a small lock. He told me these were personal effects left specifically for me, separate from the estate documents. He told me without elaborating that the key to the box was on the ring with the deed to the bottom land. He shook my hand when I stood to leave. He held it a moment longer than the occasion required, and he looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Something between professional neutrality and something older. Something that knew more than it was showing. "Your grandfather was a very deliberate man," he said, which is not something attorneys say at estate readings typically. Very deliberate about what he wanted and why. I left Garland and Weston completing their paperwork and walked down the narrow staircase and out into the March morning. I had nowhere to stay in Clarksville. Everett had asked me to return the next morning for the formal deed transfer, so I found a room at a motor lodge on the highway for $63 that I put on the last functioning card in my wallet, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the sealed envelope and the document box and thought about my grandfather. I thought about the first Saturday of every month for 11 years. I thought about the topographic maps and the paper bags of soil labeled in his careful handwriting. I thought about the legal terminology he had taught me and the instrument numbers I had written in a spiral notebook when I was 12 years old and hadn't understood and had kept anyway. I thought about the night he told me he had turned down $4.1 million for the mineral rights to the mud and said it wasn't his money to take. I thought about all of it for a long time. I did not open the envelope or the box that night. I needed to sleep first. I needed to arrive at whatever was inside them, rested and clear and ready. The next morning, I returned to Everett's office, signed the deed transfer for the 95 acres, and walked out into a morning that was cool and damp and smelled like the particular green of things waking up after a long winter. I had one thing I needed to do before I drove out to see the land. There was a diner on Main Street called Millbrook that had been there since before my father was born. I went for coffee. It was a mistake, or rather, it was something I had not prepared for. Garland was already there at the counter with two men I recognized distantly as owners of neighboring properties, people who had known my grandfather for 40 years. They were talking about the estate. They were talking about me. Garland's voice carried. It always had. "The girl never once worked that land," he was saying. "George had a soft spot for her because of the accident, God rest his soul. But sentiment isn't the same as earning something. She'll take whatever someone offers for the mud. Won't be much. One of the other men said something I couldn't make out. If anyone's fool enough to buy it, Garland said, and he picked up his coffee cup. Weston came in 20 minutes later and sat beside his father. He saw me at the far end of the counter. He looked at me once briefly with the careful blankness of someone who has been raised to be professionally polite to irrelevant things. "You heading back to Cookville after the paperwork?" he asked me, practically, the way you'd ask someone if they were done with a tool you needed. "Not right away," I said. "Planning to do something with that bottomland? I'm going to walk it," I said. He nodded slowly and turned back to his phone. I finished my coffee and drove out to the coal property in a car I had borrowed from a woman I knew in Cookville. The house was closed up. The farm management company that had been running the agricultural operation under a lease arrangement for the past 3 years had their equipment in the east field. Everything looked exactly as it had when I had visited my grandfather 2 summers earlier, except that now there was no one inside the house, and the absence of that had a physical quality to it, a weight that I hadn't expected. I parked at the end of the long gravel drive and walked. The coal property ran south from the house in a long rectangle. The main agricultural fields, planted in soybeans and winter wheat, stretched for most of the visible distance. At the far southern end, past an old fence line that had needed replacing for 15 years, the ground dropped just slightly, no more than 4 or 5 feet, over 100 yards, and the character of everything changed. The trees changed first. The orderly edges of the crop fields gave way to cedar and willow, and the tangled undergrowth of ground that had never been cleared. Then the ground itself changed, softening underfoot, becoming less certain, the kind of earth that can't quite decide if it wants to be solid or not. And then the water appeared, dark and still in most places, broken by the knobby root structures of old cypress trees that had been standing in that water longer than anyone in the Cole family had been alive. The bottomland, 95 acres of it, mosquito water, the mud, the piece of ground my grandfather had refused to sell for 30 years that the family had joked about openly that the county assessed at $19,000 and had never seen reason to revise. I stood at the edge of it for a long time. I had been here once before. I was 8 years old, and my grandfather had brought me on one of his monthly visits, driving me out from the group home for the afternoon. He had walked me down the same dirt track I had just come down to this same edge, and he had stood beside me and said nothing in particular. Just let me look. Just let the silence do whatever the silence was going to do. I had forgotten that until I was standing there again 17 years later, looking at the same water and the same trees in the same gray March light. And then I remembered something else. Something he had said on a phone call 2 or 3 years before he died, in that period when the conversations had shifted from teaching to explaining. A specific phrase I had written down and then not thought about for months. "The ridge is the key, Ellie. Everything worth knowing on that property is near the ridge." I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos I had taken of the topographic maps he had shown me over the years. I oriented myself. The ridge he had mentioned was a low elevation, barely deserving the name, a gentle rise of perhaps 3 or 4 feet that ran along the southern edge of the bottomland, separating it from the neighboring property to the south. It was covered in live oak and scrub and thick undergrowth that made it look from any distance at all like simply more of the same tangled ground. I walked east along the edge of the water toward it. The ridge was perhaps 300 yards from where I had entered the bottomland. The ground firmed up as I approached it, gradually, the way ground does when it has something solid beneath it. The trees thickened. The undergrowth became harder to push through. And then I stopped. There was a path. Not a worn path, not a trail. The kind of path that exists in the negative space of what has been deliberately concealed. Someone had cut branches and laid them across the entrance in a careful overlapping pattern that mimicked the natural fall of deadwood. Brush had been dragged over the open sections, and time had added its own layer of disguise, 2 or 3 years of leaf fall and natural growth enough to make it almost invisible. Almost. The ground beneath the branches was compressed in a way that only happens through repeated use. Someone had walked this path many times and had then taken considerable deliberate trouble to make sure it didn't look like anyone ever had. My heart was doing something strange in my chest, not quite pounding, something more insistent than that. Something that felt like being told to pay attention. I moved the branches carefully, setting them aside in the order I found them so I could replace them exactly. And I followed the path. It wound along the spine of the ridge for perhaps 150 yards, staying on the high ground, bending around the largest trees invisible from any direction, more than 20 feet away. At the end of it, hidden inside a dense stand of live oak, where the canopy overhead was so thick the light arrived in pieces, was a structure. I went still when I saw it, a low concrete box set into the ground so that only about 2 feet of it rose above the surface. The walls were poured concrete, old, stained with decades of moss and lichen, darkened by the perpetual shade. The top was a heavy steel door, flush with the surface hinged at one side. In the center of the door, a combination lock, brass, heavy duty. A master lock, the same style my grandfather had used on every gate and outbuilding on the Cole property for as long as I could remember. I stood there for a moment, just stood there with the birds loud in the canopy above me and the stillness of the bottomland around me, and my heart doing that insistent thing in my chest. Then I reached into the pocket of my jacket and took out the spiral notebook, the one I had been carrying since the call with Pruitt. I opened it to the page I had bookmarked years ago. The combination was written there in my own handwriting from when I was 15. To the left of it, in parentheses, was the note I had added at the time, North Storage Shed Gate. No such gate, no such shed. My hands were not entirely steady when I dialed the combination. The lock opened on the first try. The steel door was 2 inches of solid steel hinged with a heavy pneumatic arm that held it open when raised and sealed it completely when closed. Around the rim of the door frame was a rubber gasket that had kept the interior dry from the look of it for at least a decade, and probably longer. I could feel the difference in the air the moment the door lifted. Cooler, drier, sealed. I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The chamber below was roughly the same footprint as the exterior, perhaps 12 feet by 10. 10 feet deep, accessed by a steel ladder bolted to the concrete wall on the left side. The walls were lined with steel shelving. On the shelves were heavy-duty plastic storage bins with locking lids stacked 2 and 3 high. On the floor were 2 flat metal filing boxes, fireproof, the kind used in commercial offices. Each had a padlock, smaller versions of the same master lock on the door. On the wall beside the ladder at eye level was a small laminated card. The handwriting on it was my grandfather's. I would have known it anywhere. 4 words. Ellie, you found it. I sat on the edge of the concrete opening for a long time before I climbed down. The March light was coming through the live oak above me in pieces. The water of the bottomland was dark and still, and somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk was making a sound that carried clearly through the cold air. My grandfather had been preparing this for a long time, and now finally it was time to find out what he had been preparing. I climbed down the ladder, my boots finding the steel rungs one at a time, and I descended into the cool, dry dark of the place George Aldous Cole had built and hidden and left for me and no one else. The first bin I opened contained survey documents. Multiple copies of recorded plats from the Montgomery County Clerk's office, each one stamped and dated in red ink. Below those, a thick manila folder of correspondence between my grandfather and a geological consulting firm out of Knoxville letters going back to 1989. Below that, 3 sealed plastic bags containing USB drives labeled by year in my grandfather's handwriting. The second bin contained bound notebooks dense with figures and dates and observations written in my grandfather's precise, unhurried script. Decades of notes. Decades of watching that piece of ground and recording what he saw. The third bin contained something wrapped in 2 layers of plastic sheeting, sealed with electrical tape that had dried and cracked slightly at the edges. I peeled it open carefully. It was a document. A legal document on thick paper with the official red stamp of the Montgomery County Clerk's office in the upper right corner, and an instrument number printed beneath it in bold type. Instrument number 2005-04417-MR. I recognized that number. I had written it in my spiral notebook when I was 13 years old, sitting in the visiting room of the Hargrove County Group home, while my grandfather described to me what a designated beneficiary arrangement was, and why it was legally distinct from anything that could be altered by a will. My hands were shaking. I am not going to pretend they weren't. The document was a mineral rights lease, executed in 2005 between George Aldous Cole as lessor and Meridian Basin Resources, a Tennessee energy corporation, as lessee. The subject of the lease was the natural gas extraction rights to the 95 acres of southern tract bottomland on the Cole property. The royalty rate was 23% of gross extraction revenue. And in the designated beneficiary clause in the careful legal language that Lavinia Shreve of Houston, Texas had drafted and my grandfather had approved, and both of them had signed in front of a notary on an afternoon in 2005 when I was 4 years old, and had no idea any of this existed. The royalty payments upon the death of the lessor were assigned irrevocably and permanently not to the estate of George Cole, not to his heirs in general, but to Eleanor Grace Cole by name. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on the concrete floor of that chamber with the document in my hands and the steel shelves around me and the cold, dry air of a space that had been sealed against the world for 20 years. And I read it a 4th time. Then I reached for the sealed letter that was sitting on top of the filing box, addressed to me in my grandfather's handwriting, and I opened it. Ellie, it began. I have been trying for years to figure out how to explain this to you without making it complicated. I have decided the only way is to tell you straight. In 1989, a geological crew came onto the bottomland without asking and ran some kind of sensing equipment along the South Ridge. I caught them and held them until they explained themselves. They had found indicators of a significant natural gas deposit beneath the southern tract. The land nobody in this family had ever thought was worth a dime. I did not tell your uncle. I want you to understand why, and I want you to understand it without judgment, because this is not about judgment. Garland is a capable man who built something real with his life. But he sees land the way a banker does, as a number to be optimized. If he had known what was under that ground, he would have sold the mineral rights within a year for whatever someone offered him, and he would have believed he was being smart. He might even have been right by his own measure of things. But I had watched the energy industry in this state for 40 years. I had watched families sell mineral rights for short money and spend the rest of their lives watching someone else extract a fortune from beneath their feet. I was not going to let that happen with this ground. So I did 3 things. First, I hired an independent geological firm out of Knoxville to do a proper assessment of the southern tract. The results are in the bins. The short version is that the deposit is significant, more significant than the original crew indicated. Second, I negotiated a lease with Meridian Basin Resources in 2005, after your mother was pregnant with you, and I knew you were coming into this world. And I knew what I wanted you to have. Not a sale of rights, a lease, with a royalty rate that a Houston attorney named Lavinia Shreve told me was the best she had seen, negotiated by a private landowner in this state in 20 years. Third, I structured the lease to designate you by name as the beneficiary of all royalty payments upon my death. You were 4 years old. You couldn't claim anything yet, but the instrument was recorded. It was public record. It could not be changed by a will or a family argument or any amount of money or anything else. It has been yours since 2005. Nobody has to give it to you. The clerk's office already made it yours. The bottomland looks like nothing. I kept it looking like nothing. The surface is worthless, and that part is true. But what is under the surface is not worthless. It is the opposite of worthless. I am leaving you the surface because that is what I can do through a will. But the minerals were already yours before I died. That is what I need you to understand. I did not leave you the mud, Ellie. I left you the thing that was already yours. The mud was just the address. Take care of it. Use it wisely. Do not let anyone rush you. Your grandfather, George Bahus, sat in that concrete chamber for a long time after I finished the letter. Not because I was overwhelmed, though I was. Not because I needed to compose myself, though that was part of it. I sat there because my grandfather had built this place to be found at the right moment by the right person, and I understood that the right response to that kind of patience was not to rush. The man had waited 36 years. I could wait another hour. The air in the chamber was cool and completely still. Outside, above the steel door I had left propped open, the March sky had gone from gray to a pale, thin blue. The kind of blue that only happens on cold, clear afternoons in Tennessee when the wind has cleaned everything. I could hear the hawk still distant now, and the sound of water moving somewhere in the bottomland. The particular quiet music of ground that has been doing what it does for a very long time, without anyone paying much attention. I started with the geological correspondence. The manila folder from the Knoxville firm was thick, perhaps 80 pages of letters and attachments, spanning from 1989 to 2009. I read them in chronological order slowly, the way my grandfather had taught me to read any document that mattered, not skimming for conclusions. Reading for the full shape of things. The 1989 letters were the beginning of it. A firm called Ridgeline Geoscience, based out of Knoxville, writing to my grandfather after the initial assessment they had performed that summer. The language was technical in places, but my grandfather had annotated the margins in pencil, translating the relevant passages into plain terms the way he always did. Significant indicators of a natural gas-bearing formation beneath the southern tract. Preliminary estimate pending further assessment. Recommend core sampling at 3 locations along the South Ridge. My grandfather's note in the margin beside that last line in his careful handwriting, authorized, keep quiet. The core sampling results came back in the spring of 1990. I read that letter twice because the first time through, I was not entirely sure I was reading the numbers correctly. I was reading them correctly. The independent assessment completed in March of 1990 estimated recoverable natural gas reserves beneath the 95-acre southern tract at between 18 and 26 billion cubic feet. The lower bound assumed conservative extraction methodology and geological conditions that degraded toward the eastern edge of the formation. The upper bound reflected the more favorable conditions indicated by the core samples from the western and central locations along the ridge. 18 to 26 billion cubic feet. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I kept reading. There were two subsequent assessments, one in 1997 and one in 2009, both commissioned privately by my grandfather. Both performed by different firms, both arriving at estimates broadly consistent with the original. The 2009 assessment used more sophisticated modeling and arrived at a slightly more precise range, 20 to 28 billion cubic feet, with a high degree of confidence in the lower bound. The correspondence with Meridian Basin Resources began in 2003, 2 years before the lease was signed. My grandfather had initiated contact, not the other way around. He had written a single letter to Meridian's regional office in Nashville, describing the property in general terms and inquiring about their interest in a long-term extraction lease. What followed was 2 years of careful, unhurried negotiation that I read with a growing understanding of exactly how deliberate my grandfather had been. Meridian had pushed hard for a sale of mineral rights outright. My grandfather had declined every time without anger, without elaboration. He wanted a lease. He wanted royalties. He wanted a rate that reflected the actual value of what was under the ground rather than the assessed value of the surface above it, which everyone, including Meridian's initial negotiators, was treating as the relevant number. Lavinia Shreve's name appeared for the first time in a letter dated September of 2004. My grandfather had found her through a referral from a land rights organization in Nashville, and from the tone of the correspondence, it was clear that her involvement had changed the shape of the negotiation entirely. She was sharp and patient in equal measure, and she had apparently told Meridian's legal team in terms that my grandfather recorded admiringly in the margin of his copy of her letter, that the royalty rate they had proposed was an insult to both parties and that they should come back when they were prepared to have a serious conversation. They came back. The lease was signed in June of 2005 with a royalty rate of 23% of gross extraction revenue. Lavinia's note to my grandfather attached to the signed copy read, "This is the best rate I have negotiated for a private landowner in 20 years of practice. Do not sell the underlying rights under any circumstances." He hadn't. Meridian had requested renegotiation 5 times since 2005. I found all 5 letters and all 5 of my grandfather's responses. Each response was shorter than the last. The final one, dated February of 2023, was a single typed sentence on a half sheet of paper. The beneficiary is another party. The terms of the existing instrument are not subject to renegotiation. I held that piece of paper for a long time. He had known by February of 2023 that he was in his final years. The arthritis had progressed significantly. He had told me on our Sunday calls that the farming was increasingly difficult to manage, that his body was not cooperating, with what his mind still wanted to do. And in February of 2023, he had written a one-sentence letter to a billion-dollar energy company and told them with complete calm that the terms were not negotiable. Because the terms weren't his to negotiate, they were mine. The filing boxes on the floor required the same combination as the main door. Inside the first box was a collection of correspondence with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, official documentation of the subsurface geology of the Southern Tract, and copies of every communication between my grandfather and Meridian Basin Resources, organized chronologically in labeled folders with the particular precision of a man who understood that the paper trail was as important as the underlying reality it described. Inside the second box was a sealed letter addressed to Garland Cole. My grandfather's handwriting, not opened. I set it aside and kept reading. Near the bottom of the second filing box in a folder labeled simply, Current, was a letter from Meridian Basin Resources, dated 14 months before my grandfather's death. It was addressed to him directly on Meridian's corporate letterhead, signed by their Vice President of Regional Operations. The letter informed him that Meridian had completed its infrastructure planning for the mid-state region, that they anticipated being in a position to begin extraction operations on the Southern Tract within 12 to 18 months of the lessor's authorization, and that they looked forward to beginning the process of bringing this long-anticipated project to fruition. 12 to 18 months, which meant that sometime in the next year, possibly sooner, the ground beneath the bottomland that the Cole family had been laughing about for 30 years was going to start producing. I climbed out of the chamber in the late afternoon when the light was going long and gold through the live oak canopy. I stood on the ridge above the bottomland and looked out at the dark water and the old cypress trees standing in it, and the purple water hyacinth beginning to show at the edges of the still places. The hawk was gone. The birds were settling into the quieter rhythms of late afternoon. The mud was exactly what it had always been, exactly what everyone had always said it was, and it was also something else entirely,
Something it had always been. Simultaneously something that had been waiting with the millions of geology itself for exactly this moment.
I took out my phone and found the number for Lavinia Shreve. She answered on the third ring. "This is Lavinia." Her voice was measured and clear with the particular unhurried quality of someone who has spent 50 years in rooms where rushing was a disadvantage. "My name is Eleanor Cole," I said. "George Cole was my grandfather." There was a brief silence. Not the silence of someone caught off guard. The silence of someone who has been expecting a call and is taking a moment to acknowledge that it has finally come. "Eleanor," she said, "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years. We spoke for 40 minutes. She confirmed everything the documents had told me, and then she told me things the documents couldn't. She told me that my grandfather had called her every 18 months, without fail, to verify that the lease instrument was still properly recorded, and that no procedural issues had arisen that required attention. She told me that the last call had been 6 months before his death, when he had told her calmly and without apparent distress, that he was getting older and that Eleanor would be calling within the year. She told me that she had already prepared a full dossier on the current state of the lease, the current regulatory environment for natural gas extraction in Tennessee, and the current market conditions that would affect the royalty calculation. She had been maintaining and updating it for the past decade on her own initiative, without being asked, because she had understood from her first conversation with my grandfather that when this moment came, it would need to move efficiently. Your grandfather was one of the most patient clients I have ever worked with, she said, in 40 years of practice. What's the royalty stream worth? I asked. Conservative estimate at current rates. She gave me a number. I sat down on a cypress root at the edge of the water and looked at the dark surface of the bottomland and did not say anything for a moment. The conservative estimate was $80 million over a 25 to 30-year extraction period, assuming natural gas prices remained in the range they had occupied for the past 3 years. The upper estimate factoring in likely price appreciation and the higher end of the geological reserve assessment was $120 million. Those are real numbers, I said. They are very real numbers, Lavinia confirmed. And the royalty rate George negotiated is the reason they are that large. 23% of gross revenue is exceptional. Most private landowners in comparable situations are operating at 12 to 15%. He left significant value on the table at signing in exchange for that rate, and it has compounded over time in ways that make the original concession look very small. After I ended the call, I sat on that cypress root for a long time, watching the light leave the bottomland. Then I drove back into Clarksville and checked into the motor lodge for a second night. And I sat at the small desk by the window with my spiral notebook and a legal pad I had bought at a gas station. And I began to work through what the next steps were going to be. The first step was the courthouse. Montgomery County Clerk's office opened at 8 in the morning. I was there at 8:15, still in my jacket from the previous day, with a copy of instrument number 2005-04417-MR that I had photographed in the chamber and printed at the Motor Lodge's business center for 75 cents a page. The deputy clerk was a woman in her 50s who had been working with property records long enough that nothing surprised her. I gave her the instrument number. She typed it in. She waited. She read what came up on her screen. Then she looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that was professional, but that contained underneath the professionalism something that recognized the weight of what she was looking at. Eleanor Grace Cole, she said. Yes, as designated beneficiary of the royalty interest described in this instrument. Yes. She printed the full record and handed it to me across the counter. This has been sitting in our system for 20 years, she said. Not accusingly, almost with a kind of quiet respect. The respect of someone who works with documents for a living and understands that a document filed and properly recorded is one of the most durable things a person can create. I took the certified copy. I paid the filing fee. I walked back out into the Clarksville morning with a piece of paper that confirmed in the language of public record what George Aldous Cole had put in motion 20 years ago. I called Everett Pruitt from the parking lot. He answered immediately. "I need you to arrange a meeting," I said, "with my uncle and his son in your office as soon as possible." A pause. "I think that would be appropriate," he said. Then after another pause, "Your grandfather asked me to allow the estate proceedings to proceed as written and to allow you to discover the lease instrument through your own examination of the property." "I know," I said. "He was very specific about that." "He was specific about everything," I said. The meeting was arranged for 2 days later. I used those 2 days carefully. I spent the first day at the courthouse reviewing the complete public record associated with the Southern Tract, including every instrument filed against it in the past 50 years. Everything was exactly as it should be. The lease was clean, properly executed, properly recorded, with no encumbrances or competing claims that would complicate the picture in any way. Lavinia had been maintaining the integrity of the instrument for 2 decades, and it showed. I spent the second day reading the bound notebooks from the chamber. 3 notebooks covering the period from 1989 to 2022, written in my grandfather's precise hand. They were not journals exactly. They were records. Observations about the land, about the geology, about the negotiations with Meridian, about the regulatory environment for natural gas extraction in Tennessee, about the market conditions that would affect the royalty calculation over time. They were the written record of a man who had understood from the moment that geological crew showed up uninvited in 1989 that he was holding something significant, and who had spent the next 33 years making sure that what he was holding would land in the right hands. Toward the end of the 3rd notebook, in an entry dated the winter of 2021, there was a section that I read several times. He wrote, "Garland hired someone to look into the bottomland. I know because Delbert Greer told me he'd seen a man with a camera and a clipboard walking the south fence line in October. I made some inquiries. It was a private investigator out of Nashville. I am not troubled by this. The supplemental designation instrument is filed separately from the primary lease document, and the cross-reference is technical enough that someone who doesn't know exactly what to look for will not find it easily. If Garland has concluded that the mineral interest reverts to him as my heir, he has drawn the wrong conclusion. But I am not going to correct him. The correction will come at the right time from the right person in the right way." I set the notebook down. I had found the private investigator's report in the second filing box tucked behind the Meridian correspondence. 14 pages dated November 2020, addressed to Garland Cole at his Nashville business address. The investigator had done competent work. He had identified that there was a mineral lease associated with the southern tract of the Cole property. He had found the primary lease document, instrument number 2005-04417-MR, in the county records. He had noted the existence of a royalty interest and had identified that a designated beneficiary had been named. What he had not done, apparently, was read the supplemental designation instrument that had been filed separately and cross-referenced by number, but not by name, in the primary document. That supplemental instrument was the one that named Eleanor Grace Cole specifically. The primary document referred to it only as per supplemental instrument on file, Exhibit C. The investigator had not pulled Exhibit C. He had written in his report, "The identity of the designated royalty beneficiary could not be confirmed from available public records without further legal analysis. It is possible this interest may vest in the primary heirs of the lesser upon death, subject to the terms of the instrument. Recommend consultation with a property attorney." Garland had apparently not followed that recommendation, or if he had, the attorney he consulted had not dug deeply enough. Or perhaps he had simply heard what he expected to hear, which is that the interest would likely vest in his favor, and had stopped asking questions at that point. My grandfather had anticipated all of it. He had anticipated it, documented it, and filed the response to it in a chamber under a live oak tree, where no one who hadn't been specifically prepared would ever think to look. I held the investigator's report in my hands for a long time. The document that had almost told Garland the truth. The document that had stopped 2 lines short of the name that would have changed everything for him 4 years before the will was read. 2 lines short. 30 years of patience protected by 2 lines. The meeting at Everett Pruitt's office was set for 10 in the morning on a Thursday. I arrived first. I arranged the documents on the conference table in the order I intended to present them, with the help of a yellow legal pad on which I had outlined the sequence the night before. Certified copy of the primary lease. Certified copy of the supplemental designation instrument. The geological survey summaries from 1990 and 2009. The correspondence from Meridian Basin Resources, including the 2022 buyout offer refusal and the recent letter about anticipated extraction timelines. The private investigator's report. I placed them in a single stack face down in the center of the table. Garland and Weston arrived together at 10 past 10. Garland was in a jacket and open collar, the dressed-down version of business formal that communicates authority without effort. Weston had his laptop bag. They were talking to each other when they came through the door and finished the exchange before acknowledging that anyone else was in the room. Garland looked at me and nodded. "Eleanor." The same efficient, brief acknowledgement as before. The nod of a man executing a minor obligation. "Thank you for coming," I said. He sat down. Weston set up his laptop. Everett Pruitt took his seat at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him and his expression set to the particular neutrality he had maintained throughout every interaction I had witnessed. "You said there was something you needed to show us," Garland said. Not impatiently, but with the slight edge of a man who had other things on his schedule and was prepared to move through this efficiently. "Yes," I said. "There is." I turned over the first document and placed it in front of him. He looked at it. He picked it up. His reading glasses were in his breast pocket, and he put them on. He read for a moment. He looked up. "This is a mineral lease from 2005. "Yes." "On the bottomland." "On the 95 acres of southern tract, yes. Your grandfather signed this." He did. Garland set the document down. He was processing. I could see it in the particular stillness that came over his face, the shuddering of expression that happens when someone is recalibrating rapidly and doesn't want to show it. And the royalty interest in this lease goes to the designated beneficiary named in the supplemental instrument, I said, which was filed separately, Exhibit C. I placed the supplemental designation instrument in front of him. He picked it up. He read the first paragraph. He turned to the signature page. He looked at the name in the designated beneficiary clause. Eleanor Grace Cole. He set it down. He looked at me. He looked at Everett Pruitt. He looked back at the document. He picked it up again as though a second reading might produce a different name. It didn't. Weston. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. The ease, the settled quality of a man who knows how a room is going to go. It was still controlled, but it was working harder than it had been a minute ago. Weston looked up from his laptop. Garland slid the supplemental instrument across the table to him without another word. Weston read it. He was a commercial real estate professional. He read documents for a living. He read it in perhaps 45 seconds, and I watched his face with the particular attention of someone who has learned that the moment a number lands is usually more revealing than anything a person says afterward. The number landed. I saw it. The brief, involuntary stillness, the controlled exhale, the way he set the document down with slightly more care than the situation required, as though it were something that might break. Dad. His voice was quiet. Garland was still looking at me. What does this instrument say specifically in plain language? It says, I said that as of the death of George Aldous Cole, all royalty payments generated by the mineral extraction lease on the 95-acre Southern Tract vest irrevocably in Eleanor Grace Cole, as designated third-party beneficiary, per the terms negotiated with Meridian Basin Resources and recorded with Montgomery County in June of 2005. Garland was quiet. Weston said very quietly, the royalty rate on this lease is 23%. Yes, I said. Weston looked at me. Of gross revenue. Yes. He picked up the primary lease document and turned to the financial terms section. He read. He calculated. I could see the calculation happening in real time in the particular focus of his expression, the narrowing, the processing, the arrival. He set the document down. What is the reserve estimate on this formation? He asked. I placed the 2009 Geological Survey summary in front of him. He read it. 20 to 28 billion cubic feet. He set it down. He picked up the Meridian correspondence, the letter describing the anticipated extraction timeline. He read that. He set it down, too, with the same careful deliberateness. Dad, he said again. His voice had something in it that hadn't been there a minute ago, something that was trying not to be what it was. Everett. Garland's voice was controlled, but the ease was entirely gone now. "Did you know about this instrument?" Everett Pruitt folded his hands on the table. "Your father informed me of the instrument's existence prior to his death," he said with the careful precision of a man who has thought at length about exactly how to say this. "He asked me to allow the estate proceedings to proceed as written and to allow Eleanor to discover the instrument through her own examination of the property. He was very specific about that." Garland was still for a moment. "He asked you?" "Not a question. He was very specific," Everett said again. Garland looked at the documents on the table. He looked at me. He looked at the private investigator's report that I had placed in the stack, which he hadn't reached yet. He looked at the stack for a moment, then reached out and turned over the next document. He recognized the format immediately. The header of a private investigation report. He read the first page. I watched his face as he read the section I had read 3 times myself. The section that described the investigator's failure to locate the supplemental designation instrument. The recommendation for further legal analysis that had apparently never been pursued. He set it down on the table very carefully and looked at it for a moment without speaking. He had been 4 years from knowing. 4 years ago, he had been holding a piece of paper that was 2 lines short of his niece's name. 2 lines short of the information that would have changed every decision he had made since then. He knew I hired someone, Garland said. It was not a question. He documented it, I said. I placed the relevant page from the 3rd notebook in front of him, the entry from the winter of 2021, in my grandfather's handwriting. Garland read it. He read it again. He set it down. The room was very quiet. Outside Everett's window, the Clarksville street sounds continued without any awareness of what was happening inside the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Thursday morning in a small Tennessee city that had no idea a 36-year secret was being unwound 12 feet above the sidewalk. Weston was looking at his father. There was something moving across his face that I had not expected to see there. Not calculation, not the professional composure of a moment ago. Something more complicated than that. Something that was beginning to look around the edges like grief. He understood, I think, before his father did what this meant. Not just about the land, about everything, about the shape of a family that had arranged itself around a set of assumptions that had just been revealed to be incorrect. About a grandfather who had watched his son send an investigator and had documented it in a notebook and had said nothing and had continued quietly and without apparent disturbance to protect what he was protecting. Garland. I said his name for the first time in our conversation without Uncle in front of it. He looked at me. There's one more document. I placed the most recent letter from Meridian Basin Resources on the table. The one about the extraction timeline. The one that said 12 to 18 months. He read it. He looked up. Conservative estimate of the royalty stream over the extraction period. I said, is $80 million. The upper estimate is $120 million. The number sat in the room like the 3rd presence it was. I could feel it. Garland, could feel it. Weston had felt it already, and was now sitting with the feeling in a way that had closed him off from anything easy. Garland put his reading glasses back in his breast pocket. He looked at the table. He looked at the organized stack of documents, the 20 years of careful preparation laid out in sequence by a 23-year-old woman who had been taught one first Saturday at a time exactly how to understand what she was looking at. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before in the few encounters we'd had over the years. Not the dismissal. Not the practical efficiency. Something else. The particular look of a man who is in the process of discovering that he has fundamentally misunderstood something he thought he understood completely, and that the misunderstanding has been quietly, patiently, and thoroughly accounted for by someone else who understood it much better. He set this up, Garland said. He set it up in 2005, I said. The geological work started in 1989. 36 years. Yes. Garland looked at the table again. He never said a word. His voice had gone to a place I hadn't heard it before. Quieter. Something in it that was working to stay level. No, I said. He didn't. Weston had his hand pressed flat on the table. He was looking at it, not at his father, not at me. Just at his own hand on the table, as though he was trying to stay connected to something solid. I said some things, he said quietly, these past couple of days, about you. I know, I said. I shouldn't have. I know that too, I said. It doesn't change anything that matters. He looked up. How does it not matter? Because you drew the only conclusions the available evidence supported, I said. That's not a failure. That's just how decisions get made when someone has been keeping a very careful secret for a very long time. You saw what you were meant to see. So did your father. My grandfather made sure of it. Garland looked at me. His eyes were bright in a way that I think surprised him. He never trusted me with this, he said. There was something in his voice that was not anger. It was older than anger. It was the sound of a man who has just understood something about his father that he cannot unlearn, and who is discovering that understanding it does not make it easier. I looked at him across the table. This man who had told his father not to take me in after the accident. This man who had sat at the counter of Millbrook Diner 2 days ago and said I would take whatever someone offered for the mud. This man who had built something real and capable with his life, and who had never once understood that the most significant thing his father ever did was happening 30 feet below a piece of ground he had written off before I was born. He loved you, I said. He also knew exactly what he was doing. I don't think those two things were ever in conflict for him. Garland looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up and said the thing that I think cost him more than anything else he had said in that room. The thing that I think he had been building toward since the moment his eyes landed on my name in the designated beneficiary clause. What are you planning to do with it? Not a challenge, not a negotiation opener, a genuine question. The question of a man who has let go of a story he has been telling himself for a long time and is asking with the particular humility of that surrender what the story actually is. I reached into my jacket and took out one more document. Not from the filing boxes. This one I had written myself at the desk in the motor lodge on the second night. That, I said, is what I want to talk to you about. The document I placed on the table was 2 pages handwritten on the legal pad from the gas station. I had written it on the second night at the motor lodge after the call with Lavinia and before I had fully slept. I had written it carefully in the same way my grandfather had taught me to approach anything that mattered, not quickly. Not from the first impulse, but from the place you arrive at when you have sat with a thing long enough to understand its actual shape, rather than the shape you first imagined it to have. Garland picked it up. Weston leaned slightly in his direction to read alongside him. Neither of them spoke while they read. The room held its particular stillness. Everett Pruitt sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, the expression of a man who has understood for some time what this meeting was going to become and has been waiting patiently for it to arrive there. Outside, a truck moved down the Clarksville street. Someone in an office somewhere down the hall laughed briefly at something, a sharp, ordinary sound that had no idea what room it was interrupting. Garland finished reading and set the pages down. He did not look at Weston. He looked at me. You're offering me a share, he said, after everything. I'm offering the family a structure, I said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment, working through it. The distinction mattered to him, I could tell. A share implied charity. A structure implied something else. Something with terms and mutual obligations and the particular dignity of an arrangement between people who are both bringing something to the table. Walk me through it, he said. I had prepared for this. I had prepared for it the same way I had prepared for everything in that room, carefully, in sequence, without rushing. The 95 acres of bottomland stay exactly as they are above the waterline, I said. The extraction operates through horizontal drilling from anchor points outside the wetland boundary. No surface disturbance, no clearing. The cypress trees stay in the water. The hyacinth blooms in the spring. Nothing visible changes. Garland nodded slowly. That mattered to him too, I thought. Not for sentimental reasons necessarily, but because a man who had grown up on that land, even a man who had left it, carries certain things about the place in his body that he doesn't always know are there until someone touches them. The mineral lease with Meridian remains as George structured it, I continued. 23% royalty on gross extraction revenue. Lavinia Shreve continues as my legal representative on all lease matters. That is not negotiable. Understood, Garland said. The royalty payments, when they begin, go into a family trust administered by a 3-person board. Everett Pruitt as one trustee. Lavinia Shreve as the second. A third trustee to be selected by mutual agreement between you and me within 60 days of this meeting. Weston was writing something in a small notebook he had produced from his jacket pocket. Good. He was the one in the room who understood numbers at a practical level, and I needed him engaged rather than observing. The trust distributes on an annual basis, I said. 30% of annual royalty income is designated for the operating and improvement fund of the Cole agricultural property, the 400 acres you inherited. Not a gift, a capitalized investment in the continued productivity of that land, managed by you with annual accounting to the trust board. Equipment modernization, infrastructure repair, whatever the land needs to stay productive for the next generation. Garland was very still. The remaining 70% is held in the family trust and distributed equally between two beneficiaries, I said. You and me. He looked at me steadily. The brightness was still in his eyes. Why? He said. Not why would you do this? Why structured this way? He was asking about the architecture of it, which told me he was already past the emotional reaction and into the practical consideration, which was where I needed him to be. Because George spent 83 years on this land, I said. He worked it through droughts and floods and the farm crisis of the 80s and every variety of bad luck that a Middle Tennessee winter can manufacture. He kept it in production. He kept it solvent. He kept it in this family. The royalty income from the bottomland is the product of his patience, and the agricultural land is the product of his labor. And I believe those two things should support each other rather than exist in separate compartments. Garland looked at the table for a moment. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, I said. The instrument is yours, completely and without condition. You don't need my agreement for any of it. I know that too. So why? I thought about my grandfather's letter, about the specific sentence that had stayed with me since I read it in the concrete chamber, the one about sentiment and earning, and the difference between the two. I thought about 11 years of first Saturdays and 45-minute drives each way, and the particular way he had looked at me across the visiting room table when he was explaining something he needed me to understand. Because he didn't do all of this so I could win something, I said. He did it so the land would survive, the whole of it, the mud and the fields and everything in between. If I take the royalties and walk away from the rest of it, I've solved a problem for myself and abandoned the thing he actually cared about. That's not what the last 36 years were for. Garland looked at me for a long time. Something was moving through his face that had been working its way there since the moment he read his name in my grandfather's notebook entry from 2021. The entry that confirmed his father had known about the investigator and had said nothing and had kept protecting what he was protecting. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out his reading glasses, which he had already put away. He held them in his hand without putting them on. Just held them the way a man holds something when he needs something to do with his hands while he works through what he actually needs to say. There's a condition, I said. He looked up. One condition, non-negotiable. Weston stopped writing. Weston comes back to Montgomery County, I said. For 2 years, He works the agricultural operation not as the owner, not as the heir, as someone who is learning. Under the guidance of the men who have been farming that ground under the lease arrangement for the past 3 years. And whoever else is still around, who knew George and knows that land the way it deserves to be known. Garland looked at his son. Weston looked at me. His expression was careful in the practiced way of a man who has been trained to keep reactions internal. But there was something underneath the control that was less managed than usual. "Memphis," he said. Not an objection exactly, just a statement of the existing reality. "Memphis will still be there in 2 years," I said. "That land might not have anyone left who understands it in 10. I have a career." "Your grandfather had a life," I said. "He spent 83 years learning one piece of ground so thoroughly that he could read it the way other men read a newspaper. There is not one person left in this family or within 20 miles of this property who knows that land at that level. In another decade, there won't be anyone. That's not a small thing to lose. That's not something that can be rebuilt after the fact." Weston was quiet. "I'm not asking you to give up what you've built," I said. "I'm asking you to learn something first. 2 years. Then you go back to Memphis with whatever you've learned and whatever you want to do with it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Garland said something that I had not expected him to say, and he said it before Weston could respond, and he said it in the quiet voice of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't plan to go and has decided to be honest about where he is. "He's right to ask it of you," he said to his son. "Not I agree with Eleanor. He's right to ask it," as though he were speaking of my grandfather, as though the condition were coming from George and I were simply the one delivering it. Weston looked at his father. Garland set his reading glasses on the table. "I left that county when I was 22 years old," he said. "I told myself it was because I had better things to build somewhere else. And I did build something. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "But I also told myself that the land would always be there, and that someone else would take care of knowing it, and that I could always go back to it later when I had the time." He picked up his glasses again. George never had the luxury of later. He just had the land and the time he had, and he used every bit of it. I didn't understand that until about 20 minutes ago. Weston looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "The agricultural management," he said. "The 3 men currently working it under the lease. Are they staying?" "That's for you to determine when you get there," I said. "That's the point." He held my gaze. Something was shifting in his face slowly, like ground settling after a long rain. The professional composure was still there, but it was doing something different now. It was containing something that was not resistance. 2 years, he said. 2 years? I said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he nodded, once. The nod of a man who has made a decision and knows it. Garland looked at me. His eyes were doing the thing they had been doing since I placed his father's notebook entry on the table, the brightness that he had been managing with diminishing success. He was 67 years old. He had built his life on the conviction that he understood money and land and people and situations, that his judgment was reliable and his instincts were sound. And he was sitting in a room where every document on the table was evidence of a 36-year refutation of that conviction, assembled with more patience and precision than he had applied to anything in his own life. That is a particular kind of reckoning. It does not feel like losing exactly. It feels like arriving at a true thing that you have been standing in front of for a very long time without being able to see it clearly. He never said a word, Garland said again, quietly, mostly to himself. No, I said, every time I pushed him to sell that bottomland. He stopped, started again. He'd just say it same way every time. Nobody wants bad water ground. And then he'd change the subject. And I'd think, old man, you're too stubborn to see what's in front of you. He looked at the window, the Clarksville street, the ordinary Thursday morning continuing outside. He saw everything, the whole time. He just wasn't letting me see it until the right moment. He trusted the right moment would come, I said. He trusted you, Garland said. He looked back at me. That's what he trusted. He trusted that when the moment came, you'd know what to do with it. I didn't say anything to that. There was nothing to add to it that wouldn't diminish it. After a moment, I reached into my jacket and placed the final envelope on the table. Garland looked at it, his name in his father's handwriting on the front. The envelope that had been sitting in the fireproof filing box in the concrete chamber for years, waiting for this moment, waiting for his daughter-in-law's daughter to place it in front of him in a second-floor law office above a dry cleaning shop in Clarksville. He asked me to give you this in person, I said. Not through Everett, in person. Garland picked it up. He held it for a moment the way my grandfather's letter had held me in the suspension before the beginning, in the space where you know that what you are about to read is going to change the shape of something you thought was already fixed. He opened it. He read slowly. I could tell by the pace of his eyes moving across the page. He was reading every word. He read it twice. Then he folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the table and did not speak for a long moment. Weston did not ask what it said. He understood, I think, that his father would tell him when the time was right, and that this was not that time. Everett Pruitt sat with his hands folded, looking at a point slightly above the table, giving the room the professional courtesy of privacy within its own silence. He says he was proud, Garland said finally. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something now. He says he built something real and that he knew it. He says he loved me. A pause. He says he also knew exactly what he was doing. He set the letter down. He says those two things were never in conflict. He looked at me. His eyes were bright, and he had stopped trying to manage it. That sounds right, I said. That sounds exactly like him. Garland nodded, a very small movement, the nod of a man at the end of a long argument with himself, arriving at the truth of it, acknowledging it without drama, because drama would be disrespectful to what the truth actually cost. We signed the preliminary partnership agreement that afternoon. Everett had the framework ready, which told me he had been expecting this meeting to go this way, which told me my grandfather had told him how he expected it to go, which told me that even this had been accounted for in 36 years of preparation. The formal trust documents would take several weeks to draft properly. Lavinia would be involved from Houston. Everett would handle the local instruments. The third trustee selection would happen within the 60-day window I had specified. There were details that would require careful legal architecture and the kind of patience that good legal work requires. But the fundamental shape of things was agreed upon that afternoon in a room above a dry cleaning shop in Clarksville, Tennessee, with the documents of 36 years of patience spread across the conference table, and the March light coming through the window at a low angle that made everything in the room look slightly more deliberate than it usually did. Weston left for Memphis the following Sunday to begin the process of arranging his affairs there. He gave notice at his firm the following Tuesday. He arrived back in Montgomery County 6 weeks later, with 2 boxes of books and a truck full of clothing that was approximately 30% appropriate for what he was about to spend 2 years doing, and 70% not. He did not complain about this. He made a list of what he needed and went to the farm supply store in Clarksville and spent an hour talking to a man behind the counter who had been supplying the coal operation for 20 years and who looked at Weston with the particular evaluating expression of someone who has seen the children of farm families arrive back at the land and knows within a few minutes which ones are going to make it and which ones are not. He told me later, months into the second year, that the man had looked at him for a long moment and then said quietly, "You look like your grandfather," and that it had hit him somewhere he hadn't known was open. I showed Weston the concrete chamber on his third day back. I walked him down the hidden path through the live oak, moved the concealing branches the way I had learned to move them, lifted the steel door with its pneumatic arm, and climbed down the ladder ahead of him. He stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at the shelving, the bins, the filing boxes, the laminated card in my grandfather's handwriting. He read the card. "Ellie, you found it." He stood there for a long time. "How long did it take you to find it?" he asked. "A few hours," I said, after I knew what I was looking for. "And you knew what you were looking for because he spent 11 years teaching me," I said. "One first Saturday a month." Weston was quiet. He looked at the shelving, at the decades of careful documentation, at the evidence of a man who had understood that the most important thing he could do with what he knew was transfer it carefully and completely to the person he trusted to use it correctly. "I used to wonder," Weston said, "why he bothered visiting you every month. My dad used to say it was because of the guilt about your parents, about not taking you in." He paused. "He was wrong about that, wasn't he? He visited me because there was something he needed me to know," I said. The visiting was the teaching was the preparation was the whole point. Weston looked at the laminated card one more time. "He chose well," he said. I didn't respond to that. I wasn't sure it was mine to accept. I had been the recipient of 36 years of someone else's choosing. What I had done with it so far was follow the path that had been prepared for me, which had required its own kind of courage, but was a different thing from the original choosing. The original choosing had been my grandfather's, and it belonged to him. The extraction operation began 15 months after that Thursday morning in Everett's office. Meridian's infrastructure work started in the fall. The horizontal drilling equipment arrived on the neighboring property to the south, where Meridian had negotiated a surface access agreement for the anchor points. The drilling itself was invisible from the bottomland, which was exactly what I had required as a condition of authorizing the commencement of operations. Lavinia had written that condition into a supplemental agreement with Meridian that had taken 2 months to negotiate, and that she had told me when it was finally signed was the kind of thing my grandfather would have been proud of. The first royalty payment arrived the following spring, a direct deposit into the family trust account that Everett called me about on a Tuesday morning in April, clearing his throat twice before telling me the amount. The amount was more than I had made in the previous 4 years of working construction jobs in Cookeville and Nashville. Combined, I did not celebrate. I am not sure I even knew how to in that moment. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated than celebration. A kind of settling, the feeling of a weight that has been present for so long, you have stopped noticing it finally coming to rest. I drove out to the Cole property that afternoon. Weston was in the east field with the farm manager, a third-generation Montgomery County farmer named Durwood Ballard, who had been working the Cole land for 11 years, and who had by that point developed a grudging respect for Weston that he expressed through the particular medium of men who work the land, which is to say, by talking to him directly and in full sentences rather than around him. I parked at the house and walked south. Down the long gravel drive, past the winter wheat that was just beginning to show green in the east fields, past the old fence line that Weston had repaired in November with materials from the Trust's operating fund. The ground softened, the trees changed, the willows and cedars gave way to the denser growth at the edge of the bottomland, and then the water appeared dark and perfectly still in the April afternoon, with the purple of the water hyacinth beginning at the edges of the still places. The cypress trees were standing in the water where they had always stood, the knobby structures of their root systems breaking the surface in the same places they had broken it when my grandfather brought me here at 8 years old and stood beside me and said nothing and let me look. I stood at the edge for a long time. I thought about the first Saturday of every month for 11 years, about the 45-minute drive each way in the old green pickup, about the paper bags of soil labeled in careful handwriting, and the topographic maps with pencil marks, and the spiral notebooks I had kept since I was 9 years old, in the bottom of a dresser drawer, in the Hargrove County group home. I thought about the Sunday phone calls, about the shift in his last years from teaching to explaining, about the night he told me he had turned down $4.1 million and said it wasn't his money to take. I thought about what it costs a person to be patient for 36 years, to hold a secret of that size, to watch the people around you misunderstand you completely, to hear them call your most deliberate work a folly, to let them laugh at it in front of you, and to say nothing because the time is not right, and you trust that the right time will come if you prepare for it faithfully enough. That is a specific kind of faith. It is not the faith of someone who believes things will work out. It is the faith of someone who has done the work to make them work out, and who trusts the work rather than hoping for the outcome. It is the faith of a farmer. The understanding that you plant things in the earth for someone else to harvest, and that the planting is the real labor, and the harvest is only the evidence of it. The bottomland was still the bottomland. I want to be clear about that. The extraction operation was running 400 feet beneath my feet, through horizontal shafts that intersected the gas formation without disturbing anything above. The surface was exactly what it had always been. 95 acres of low, wet, dark-watered ground that smelled like standing water and living things, and the particular rich rot of an ecosystem that has been doing its own work for centuries without any help or interference from the people who happened to own the title to the surface above it. A biological survey conducted as part of the extraction permitting process had identified 3 species of migratory waterfowl using the wetland as a rest stop that the county had no previous documentation of. The bottomland was under review for a permanent conservation easement with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, which would protect it from surface development in perpetuity. Lavinia had handled the initial filings and had told me the process was moving faster than usual, which she attributed to the quality of the biological survey and the absence of any competing development interest in the property. My grandfather would have found all of that exactly right. He would have found it right in the particular quiet way he found things right, the way that involves no particular expression and no comment, and a small internal satisfaction that he carries without announcing it. The way of a man who did a difficult thing for a long time for specific reasons, and who, if he could have stood beside me on that ridge in April and seen how it had resolved, would have nodded once and then probably started telling me something about the water table. I heard footsteps behind me on the path. Weston came through the undergrowth at the edge of the bottomland and stopped beside me. He was wearing work boots that had been new in October and were no longer. There was clay on his jacket. He had been in the east field since early morning, and it showed. He stood beside me and looked at the water. Durwood says the southwest section needs a tile drain replaced before planting, he said. He says it's been needed for 6 years and George knew about it, but the operating budget under the old lease didn't allow for it. The trust can cover it, I said. I know. I've already pulled quotes. He paused. 3 contractors. I can have a comparison ready by Thursday. I looked at him. The man who had arrived 6 weeks ago with boxes of books and a truck full of wrong clothing, who had sat in a law office in March with his hand flat on the table trying to hold on to something solid while the shape of his family rearranged itself around him, who had looked at the laminated card in the concrete chamber and been quiet for a long time. Durwood said something to me this morning, Weston said. He was still looking at the water. I was asking about the rotation schedule for the North Field. He was explaining it, and partway through, he just stopped and looked at me and said, "You asked the right questions, son. Like your grandfather." He was quiet for a moment. "I never met him the way you did," he said. "He was always just the old man on the farm, the one who didn't want to modernize, the one who wouldn't sell the bottomland." He paused. I thought I understood him. I thought my dad understood him. Turns out neither of us understood the first thing about him. "He was patient with that," I said. "I know." Weston looked at the water for another moment. "I'm starting to understand why." The red-tailed hawk was back. I heard it before I saw it. The sharp cry carrying across the still water, and then it crossed the opening above the bottomland in one long, unhurried line and disappeared into the tree line on the far side. "The conservation easement application," I said. "If it's approved, the bottomland is protected permanently, development-proof. Even after the gas formation is fully extracted in 25 or 30 years, the surface stays exactly as it is." "Good," Weston said, simply, without qualification. We stood there for a while longer. The April light was going warm and low. The water hyacinth moved slightly at the edges of the still places, responding to some current in the water that was invisible from the surface. The cypress trees stood in the water where they had always stood. Garland came out to the property for the first time in 8 months that following Sunday. He arrived in the late morning, driving himself without calling ahead. Weston and I were both there. Weston was working. I was walking the east boundary of the bottomland, which I had gotten into the habit of doing on Sunday mornings, learning the particular personality of each section of it, the way my grandfather had learned it over 60 years. I heard Garland's truck on the gravel drive and walked back up toward the house. He was standing at the edge of the drive, looking at the east fields. He looked older than he had in Everett's office. Not frail, just older in the way that happens when something inside a person adjusts to a new understanding of itself, and the adjustment shows in the face. "I drove down past the south fence," he said when I came close enough. "On the county road. You can't see anything from there." "That was a condition of the extraction agreement," I said. He nodded. He looked at the fields. "Weston says the southwest section is getting a tile drain." He pulled 3 quotes. Garland looked at me with something that was close to a smile. Not quite. Something adjacent. He called me Thursday about the quotes, asked me which contractor I'd used for the north irrigation line in 2019. He paused. He remembered I'd mentioned it years ago, in passing. "He's paying attention," I said. "He is." Garland looked at the fields for another moment. George used to say that the first thing about land is that it rewards attention. He said most people think it rewards money or equipment or seed selection, but those are all downstream of attention. You have to look at it first. Really look. He paused. I thought that was sentiment, something old men say because they've run out of practical advice. It's not sentiment, I said. I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. Can I walk down to the bottomland? Of course, I said. We walked together down the same dirt track I had walked on the morning after the will reading, the track that my grandfather's boots had worn into the earth over decades of use, the narrow ruts with the grass growing down the center, the cedars and willows at the edge of the wet ground, the softening of the earth underfoot, the appearance of the water. Garland stood at the edge and looked at it. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I stopped counting the seconds and just let the silence be what it was. He brought me here once, he said, when I was about 12. Just stood here and didn't say anything. I thought he was being strange. He paused. I went back to the house after 10 minutes because I was bored. I didn't say anything. I've thought about that a lot, he said. These past weeks, what it cost him that I went back to the house. I don't think it cost him anything, I said. I think he already knew what he needed to know about who he was going to trust with this. Garland looked at me. You were 8 when he brought you here. I stayed, I said. He looked at the water. You stayed, he said. The hawk appeared again, lower this time, working the edge of the tree line on the far side of the water in long, patient arcs, looking for something. Patient enough to keep looking until it found it. I told your Uncle Garland not to take you in, Garland said. The words came out measured and deliberate, the way words come out when someone has been carrying them for a while and has decided the time to put them down is now. After the accident, when your grandfather wanted to bring you home, I was the one who said no. I looked at him. I told him it wasn't practical, he said, that he was too old, that he had no business taking on a 7-year-old child on his own. A pause. I was protecting myself from the inconvenience of feeling responsible. I told myself I was being realistic. He looked at me steadily. I was wrong. That was a costly thing to be wrong about. I know it was, I said. I'm sorry for it. The words were simple and direct and carried the particular weight of words that have been thought about for a long time before being spoken. Not performative, not seeking a specific response. Just the honest placement of something true in the space between two people who needed it to be placed there. I know you are, I said. It's real. We stood at the edge of the bottomland for a while longer. The hawk made one more pass across the water and then lifted effortlessly into the April sky and became a shape against the blue and then nothing at all. Then Garland said, I'd like to come back more, if that's all right. This is your family's land, I said. It has been for 130 years. It's your family's land too, he said. Yes, I said. It is. We walked back up the track toward the house. The winter wheat in the east fields was green and dense and moving slightly in the afternoon breeze in the particular way that healthy wheat moves with confidence. The way something moves when it is doing exactly what it is meant to do in exactly the soil it was meant to do it in. Weston was in the doorway of the equipment barn when we came up the track. He looked at his father and then at me, and then back at his father with the evaluating look of someone who is trying to determine what has happened between two people without asking directly. Garland looked at his son. Durwood says you've been out before first light every morning this week, he said. The Eastfield irrigation has a pressure issue on the north manifold, Weston said. It's worse in the early morning. You have to catch it before the temperature comes up. Garland looked at him for a moment. Something moved through his face. That's exactly what your grandfather would have said, he told him, quietly. Not as a compliment exactly, as a recognition, as the acknowledgement of something that has been transferred from one person to another through the mechanism of attention and time and the particular patience of land that has been waiting for someone to pay it. Weston looked at his father. He didn't say anything, but something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly in the way things change when a weight you've been carrying finds somewhere to rest. The bottomland is still the bottomland. I want to end there with that simple fact because I think it is the most important thing about all of it. The extraction operation runs 400 feet beneath the surface through horizontal shafts that leave nothing disturbed above. The cypress trees are in the water. The water hyacinth blooms purple in April. The hawk works the tree line on still mornings. The 3 species of migratory waterfowl that the Biological Survey identified continue to use the wetland as a rest stop on their seasonal routes, unaware and unbothered by the fact that a legal instrument filed in 2005 changed the shape of a family and a fortune that they have no interest in. The conservation easement was approved the following spring. The bottomland is now permanently protected from surface development in perpetuity, regardless of who holds the title. The extraction will run its course over the next 25 or 30 years, and then the formation will be depleted and the operation will cease, and the surface above it will still be exactly what it was when my grandfather stood a geological crew down in 1989 and began the longest and most patient plan I have ever known anyone to execute. 95 acres of low, wet, dark-watered ground that smells like standing water and living things, and the particular green of something that has been doing what it does for a very long time, without anyone paying much attention. He did not leave me the mud. He left me the thing that was already mine. And the mud patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the fortunes of the people who stand at its edge and look at it was just the address. That is the faith of a farmer. You plant things in the earth for someone else to harvest, and you trust the earth to hold what you have placed in it, and you trust the right person to find it when the time comes. He trusted me. I have tried in everything that followed to be worth that trust. I think about him on the mornings when I walk down to the bottomland, when the light is low and the water is still, and the hawk is working the far tree line, and Weston is already in the east field, and Garland's truck is on the county road, coming in for a Sunday visit. I think about the first Saturday of every month for 11 years. I think about the things he taught me one careful conversation at a time in a visiting room in Hargrove County, while the world outside went about its business without any idea what was being transferred across that table. I think about what a person can do with 36 years of patience and a piece of ground that nobody wants. He showed me, and I will spend the rest of my life understanding what he showed me, which is what he intended. That is enough. That is everything.